This is
My
your
pleasure.
third appearance on the show, and I think you are the guest with the most appearances. So that's awesome. Congratulations.
I hold the record.
Oh yeah, now you're the record holder. So a lot has been going on lately, right? And I'm speaking about what's happening in Israel and Palestine. And people have had different opinions. And I think there isn't any time where a court that says, in war, truth is the first casualty. That applies more than right now, right? Because we have seen different stories from different angles, everyone with their own agenda. We have seen different African countries also taking different sides. But what's really going on? And if we want to understand what's unfolding in Israel and Palestine right now, where do we start tracing that?
Well, I think we can discuss the modern era, because if we start getting into the biblical times, that's a conversation that I don't think, first of all, is extremely productive. I think following the tragedy and the calamity that befell the Jewish people in Europe, particularly in countries like Nazi Germany, I think there was a strong case globally for the creation of a Jewish state. I think, as you may know, historically, even parts of Uganda and Kenya were even considered as a place where they would create a Jewish state to provide a safe nation for the victims and the survivors and descendants of the Holocaust in Europe. Ultimately, it became Palestine. Palestine, which of course, in the demise of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, was controlled by the British and British allies. So that became the location where the State of Israel was ultimately created. And of course, it involved the displacement of the Arab populations who were residing in that part, shortly followed by the war between the new Jewish state of Israel and the surrounding Arab countries who were pushing the interest of the Palestinians who had been displaced. So I think the problem initiated around that time when there was no intervention to create a viable Palestinian state alongside the Jewish state of Israel. So that is the underlying problem, of course, because that is the problem that exists with us up today. There's no viable Palestinian state. Gaza, as you know, has been described by many people as a large open prison without a viable economy. It doesn't even have an international airport. It does not control its ports. So it's not a viable entity. And the other part, which is settled by where Palestinians reside, rather, is the West Bank. And on the West Bank, we have the occupation, the illegal occupation by Israel. And you have the settler population increasing exponentially and taking over territory which is supposed to comprise part of the proposed or presumed independent Palestinian state. So you have this narrative where it is becoming apparent not only to Palestinians, but to people around the world who follow that part of the world, follow that region, that the prospects of ever having an independent Palestinian state is dwindling before our very eyes. So if you have that type of combustible situation, it should not be surprising that conflict is going to erupt periodically until that issue is resolved, until there's a serious and concerted and successful effort to create a separate independent Palestinian state. The two-state solution that keeps coming up again and again in the narrative. That is the underlying condition, and that is the underlying problem. Now, in terms of taking sides, there are not really sides to be taken in a situation like this. There is a state of Israel. And of course, there are others who still speak in a form of fantasy that Israel should not exist. They go back to the history. They say the creation was violent. The creation was illegal. Hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of Palestinians displaced. But the fact of the matter is that the state of Israel exists. It's not going to disappear, you see? Whether people like it or not. I think to dwell on that as a conversation is not serious. And people who think there's some fantastic way to make the state of Israel disappear, those are not serious people either, you see? So the serious question is, when is there going to be a concerted, dedicated, and real effort, a successful one, to create the Palestinian state? That is the conversation which was no longer on the headlines for a very long time. I think what is going on right now has caught the global opinion. You see the amount of protests that are ongoing all over the world in terms of the outrage against the ongoing bombing by Israel of Gaza. And of course, that bombing is not happening in a vacuum. It started after the attack on Israel by Hamas, which included the killing of some Israeli soldiers, the killing primarily of Israeli civilians, and the kidnapping primarily of Israeli civilians as well. So now we have the prospects of having a back and forth between the militarily much more powerful Israel, economically much more powerful Israel, and the weak Palestinian side, a back and forth. Or we have the prospects and the option of getting the peace process back on track, with the ultimate end being a Palestinian state. Perhaps this conflict, the ongoing conflict right now, would impress upon the powers that be that you cannot constantly bury this issue under the rug, because there's a lull, a period of lull in the conflict. You think, okay, we can ignore it perpetually, which was what was ongoing until the eruption that we are discussing today. So in terms of the history and in terms of where we are today, I think this would be the summary that I can offer.
And so most media outlets have been calling the Hamas a terrorist organization, but is that true? Are they a terrorist organization, or are they an organization that is trying to fight for their land?
Well, here's how I can answer that question. You can be an organization trying to fight for liberation, and you can commit terror and acts of terrorism at the same time. Yeah, the two are not mutually exclusive. We have to look at every situation in its context. So if we go back historically, we look at the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, the so-called Mau Mau, which of course was not what they called themselves. That was a name given to them by the British colonial authorities. And it was also, it had a pejorative tone to demonize them. And they were castigated as not only terrorists, but savages as well. If you look at the narrative of those days, the British press, the US press said these were savages under the influence of witch doctors who were mesmerized and confused by modern civilization. So they were fighting to go back to the barbaric African past. See? So they were demonized. But they knew their objectives. And that's why their official name was the Kenya Land and Freedom Army. They committed acts of terrorism in that fight. So you see, that is something that we have to examine openly and honestly, and not wish it away or deny it. But just as I said, the two are not mutually exclusive. The question would have to be, had the Kenya Land and Freedom Army not committed some of the acts of terror, which they did? If you go to a British settler family which had illegally stolen your land and your farm and settled on it, which was the case in Kenya, about 2 million acres stolen from Africans and given to Europeans who called themselves settlers, even though they were not settlers. They violently committed ethnic cleansing and took over the land. And now the original inhabitants became employees, laborers on land that used to be theirs, now occupied by the Europeans. So some of the tactics that the Kenya Land and Freedom Army did was to attack these homes and kill the Europeans who had occupied their farms. And some of the tactics they used were machetes. They cut them. For anybody who denies that that was not an act of terror, that would not be an honest person. You see? So we have to speak honestly and then examine the context. You can support the fight for Kenyan liberation, which of course I do and did, right? Without pretending that they did not commit acts of terror in the fight. Just as the British also committed acts of terror and terrorism against these fighters. The British, in fact, had a shoot at sight order Any African who was observed within a 1-mile radius of the forest where the Kenya Land and Freedom Army fighters were could be shot. And they were shot. Thousands taken to concentration camps because the British could not distinguish who was supporting the liberation struggle, who was a member. They just happened to be African, right? So there was a collective punishment against them. And the British said they were reacting to the terrorism of the Kenya Land and Freedom Army. And in that conversation, the origin of the conflict was being ignored. The fact that the displacement had occurred, the injustice of the displacement, that ultimately brought us to that struggle, which ultimately ended, as you know, politically.
And I think
independent Kenya being created. And it took a long time, but now there is a revisiting of the history. There even now is a statue in Nairobi of Dedan Kimathi, who was the leader of the Kenya Land and Freedom Army. So you see what I'm looking at the parallels. If we go to Algeria, the same thing. The FNLA, during the liberation struggle against France, they too committed acts of terror, just like the French committed acts of terror. The bombings by the French, killing, perhaps more than 1 million Algerians. The FNLA placing bombs in public buildings in Algiers, clearly acts of terror, correct? So when you ask the question that some people are saying Hamas is a terrorist organization, or is Hamas fighting for Palestinian independence? The two are not mutually exclusive, just as in these examples I just gave you. The example of the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, the example of the FNLA, and the example of many of the liberation organizations that fought for independence in Africa as well. So I think the focus needs to go back to why are these actions occurring? When we look at the bombing that is ongoing right now in Gaza, who could deny that those amount to acts of terrorism as well against the civilian population in Gaza? Because there's the collective punishment, the same collective punishment that we saw by the British in Kenya, that we saw by the French in Algeria. We saw in many other theaters. We saw against Africans in South Africa. We saw against Africans in what was then Rhodesia, Mozambique, Angola. So I think it's important to see these conflicts in a broader historical context. And people who don't want to see it that way, I think, are people who are not dedicated to pushing that there needs to be a political resolution to this conflict. If it comes to just armed conflict alone, there's no question that Israel will always prevail. Israel has one of the most sophisticated militaries in the world, armed and financed by the United States, a viable economy, also boosted by the United States. But that is not going to ensure peace in the region. Peace can only be ensured by having a political resolution And you cannot have a political resolution without having an independent Palestinian state. Israel has the right to have a viable, independent Jewish state, which it has right now. And the Palestinians also have the right to have an independent, viable state.
And so Israel needed an independent, viable state, and they came to Palestine and they took some of their land. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And
that is
so,
a history that cannot be unwritten, is what my main argument is. And for people who insist on rewriting that history, I think that is a fantasy.
And so if, I mean, okay, and I understand when you said that, Israel needed a place where they could establish their independent state, same with Palestine. And the fact that, I'll assume it's when you said Israel were also, the Jews are considering, you said Kenya and Uganda, correct? To establish the independent state.
Yes, but also you have to understand that at that time, much of the world are dominated by the imperial colonial powers. So it is Britain actually that, and the United States also at some point making the determination that this is the region that should be considered, So I wanted to just put that in context, right? Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. But isn't it surprising the fact that the Jews came to Palestine and took much of their land, and right now, even the little land that the Palestinians have to establish their independent state, it seems as if Israel still wants to take it. I think it's only logical for one to take sides with Palestine and say, hey guys, you have established your independent state. These guys were here and you took their land, and even the little land that they have right now, you're also trying to take it from them.
Correct. I don't think that is a debate. I mean, certainly the occupied territory, the settlements are expanding, as I said early on, in an exponential rate, which of course says many things, right? Number one, since it is not being stopped by the powers that be, it means the Palestinians could conclude that the world has abandoned them. Correct? They could conclude that the expansion is going to continue unchecked, which means ultimately there will be no space left to create that Palestinian state. So that is why that situation is very dangerous and very explosive. And not only the expansion, but the abuse and mistreatment of the Palestinians in the occupied territory, which has been ongoing. I mean, the reports that in the year alone, more than maybe 150, I don't have the exact figures, of Palestinians have been killed in isolated incidents that are not, because there's a difference, if you kill 150 people or 200 in one incident, that's front page, correct? All over the world.
Yeah.
But if you kill one or two every day, it is not front page, but by the end of the year,
headlines.
Exactly. So that is ongoing. And then and this is where, Jimmy Carter wrote that book, former President Carter, and referred to that situation as apartheid. And that's what he was referring to, where to just travel from one short distance to another, they have to go through military checkpoints. There are some roads that Palestinians are not allowed to travel, only designated for Israelis, So you have that humiliation as well that is ongoing. So you have an increasingly explosive situation. People who pretend they were surprised by the attack from Hamas are not serious people. They're not serious and they're not honest. Of course, it was a violent attack. As I said, primarily, most of the victims have been civilians. But to pretend that it came out of nowhere is completely dishonest and not credible. A person who says that is lying and has not been honestly evaluating the situation, the explosive situation that existed and currently exists between Israel and the Palestinians. And then this is another thing that has been ongoing and supported by the United States. This dedicated effort, and you see this if you follow in the media, by Israel to make peace with our Arab neighbors. That is the narrative now on the front pages. Make peace with everybody except the Palestinians. That is the narrative. So it's lauded as a huge success story because Israel is on the verge of making peace with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia are not facing any displacement by Israel. Saudi Arabia is not facing any expansion of settlements by Israelis. So by avoiding the elephant in the room, that is why we keep coming back to the kind of conflict that we are witnessing today. That situation can never be wished away, and it will never be wished away. Because now you have the state of Israel and the people who look at the victims of the Hamas attack becoming more embittered, the animosity increasing. And on the other side, you have the loved ones and families of the victim of the ongoing bombing campaign becoming much more embittered as well, more vengeful as well. We cannot afford this back and forth without a powerful country like the United States, which sustains the power of Israel, coming forward and explicitly saying, this is the timeline to start these negotiations, which should end in a Palestinian state. Otherwise, they are directly complicit in the calamity that is unfolding by maintaining that silence. And it can only come from a power like the United States. The United States has the financial resources and the political capital, which of course is dwindling very fast when you're seen as being partisan toward one side. You're no longer seen as a neutral broker. And that's a problem. And it's a problem that should not be underestimated. Even though we're seeing the destructive bombings ongoing in Gaza right now, this conflict could easily escalate into something much, much bigger. Because even the neighboring Arab countries that can be seen as having normalized relations with Israel, they're facing a lot of domestic challenges too, you see? Because people cannot just sit there and watch what is ongoing and not be that aggrieved. So it could affect their own domestic calculation and make it very difficult for them not to resist becoming a part of this conflict. And then what do you do after that? That is why the biggest thing that should happen right now is for the US to explicitly say there needs to be an end to the ongoing conflict. And the next day, let's start talking when is the first of the many meetings going to occur to resolve this diplomatically and to have politically and to have a Palestinian state. That is a statement that is needed. That is a statement that could diffuse a lot of the heat that is now being generated all over the world by the protests that I'm sure you've been following in media.
So when you read at the news in the media, there are three sides. There's the Palestinians, the Jews, Israelites, and then the Hamas. Who are the Hamas?
Very interesting. Hamas, of course, is much more militant than the Palestinian Authority. And Hamas, as you recall, had actually won the elections in when there was an election which was
2007?
seen, right, which was seen as, you know, a relatively fair election, and they won clearly. But why does a Hamas win? A Hamas winning, you'd have to examine the objective conditions on the ground. And the Palestinian Authority had by that time become discredited and not seen as an entity that could deliver an independent Palestinian state. Had been co-opted. If you do research, you even Google, you see all these stories about corruption, not able to deliver any of the services, not really struggling for an independent Palestinian state. And of course, one of the primary sponsors of Hamas is Iran. And as you know, Iran and Israel have a very contentious relationship as well. I think it was, is it Ahmadinejad? I'm saying his name wrong, one of the former presidents, who constantly was calling for, driving, Israel into the sea, and Israel saying, Iran presents an existential threat. So even though they are not at war, they're almost at a state of war as well. But I think all of this could be diffused if there's a dedicated, serious, credible process toward the creation of a Palestinian state. That is the only thing, I believe, that will and should change the narrative. And it's what is needed. The Palestinians need an independent state. And they would follow any organization, I believe, that appears much more capable of delivering that Palestinian state. And to many, it is certainly not the Palestinian Authority, which, as you know, has a very aged leadership in the first place, and are not even delivering on any of the services. They're completely discredited. And often, the outside world has been going through the pretense of elevating them as the authentic representatives of the Palestinian aspirations. And that, of course, also goes back to the problem of the outside, the powers like the United States not being serious. Because ultimately you deal, if you're going to talk peace, you deal with the enemy. The so-called enemy is who you deal with. When Israel was still at a state of war with Egypt, Israel dealt with Egypt, and Egypt dealt with Israel. And they signed the Camp David Accord under Carter, who, by the way, was one of the more serious United States presidents in really dedicating effort to try to resolve this conflict. And part of the problem also speaks to another issue, which needs to be mentioned: how corrupt political systems are under capitalism, and how it's tied to lobbying and campaign contributions. So, and this is the stark situation where you get to see how it's demonstrated. Many American politicians, of course, are human beings. So they know that the bombing of Gaza is against international law, and it's just wrong. The deaths of so many civilians, including half of them children, because it's a very young population anyway. But they won't say anything. They know, yes, what Hamas committed, and as I said, you can be fighting a liberation struggle, you can commit terrorism at the same time. What they committed was terror. But they also know at the same time that is not justification of the kind of blanket bombing that we're seeing in Gaza. But they won't say that because of the way the political system operates in this country. They're afraid that if they do that, then another candidate for whichever political office they have, whether it's a member of the House of Representatives, whether it's a senator, that a rival candidate is going to be able to raise more money and to get elected and to get them out of office. So that's how such a corrupt way of running politics can also translate into related disasters in other parts of the world. You see, at some point, and this is the irony, right? So the last count was what? Almost 7,000 dead so far. Do you think the United States will keep quiet if the number goes up to 20,000 or to 30,000 or to 50? I don't think so. I don't think they can keep quiet if it reaches 50,000. So it shows you the cold calculus and the cold-heartedness. The people know it's wrong, but they're hoping the number doesn't go up too high. Which means you're admitting that you don't value the lives of the Palestinians that much. Until it crosses a certain threshold, then that threshold you identify as, okay, this is now unconscionable. Is it 100,000? I don't know. Is it 50? I don't know. But apparently it is not 7,000 because we know that for a fact by what we are seeing. So this conversation we are having is revealing so many things that are so wrong about this conflict. It's not just Hamas committing the acts of terror, Israel countering with similar terror against civilians in Gaza, but it is the enablers also who allow this to happen and shrinking the prospects of having peace and a viable Palestinian state. And that's what I have serious issues with. And I hope that, this conversation we're having allow people to think in a broader context, are some human beings' lives much more precious than others, And I'm not just talking about this setting alone. I'm talking about other conflicts that we see, around the world. At the end of the day, it comes to the inequity in power, political power, economic power, and diplomatic power, and the insistence that might is right. That is the problem we're dealing with.
A lot of early African leaders were very vocal about what was going on in Palestine. And let me read you a quote by Julius Nyerere. He said, it's not really a quote, but it was him speaking about the situation in Palestine and Israel. He said, our generation was a generation of the nationalist struggle for independence of our own countries. But the plight of Palestinians is very different and much worse. They have been deprived of their own land. They're a nation without a land of their own. They, therefore, deserve the support of Tanzania and the entire world.
Yes.
What role is Africa expected to play in what's going on between Israel and Palestine? Because
Africa,
Julius Nyerere,
yes, go ahead.
Thomas Sankara, Muammar Gaddafi, these were some of the African leaders who were really very vocal about what was going on in Palestine. And I think it's only right now that the whole world has caught on with what's going on. And so is there a specific role that African countries have to play with regards to what's going on in Hamas? In Palestine?
Well, it's very difficult because collectively, African countries have become weaker diplomatically. It's not to say that they were much stronger in the past, but they had certain leaders who commanded global appeal. And that also tells you the power of leadership. Julius Nyerere, a intellectual, intelligent, humanistic, compassionate leader whose credentials allowed him to speak on any issue and for it not to be ignored. A leader of Nelson Mandela's credentials could speak and not be ignored. Which African president today has that type of gravitas? And that is the problem that, Africa is facing. Of course, they could have some impact if they speak with one voice. Then the numbers give them, that weight. And that's the tragedy, Africa has become economically much more weaker, politically too. There's, of course, there's a lot of activities going on now in various African countries where the youth are pushing toward a new narrative. But that is the conversation for another day. But that process is happening. And part of it, of course, is the reaction to the impotence, African impotence, which has been demonstrated many, many times. So if African nations or Africa collectively could not defend Libya against NATO, that to me is the best evidence of the impotence of Africa as a collective. So, you know, when, let's say they say something even constructive, we are demanding for a ceasefire. Who would take it that seriously, first of all? You see, that's the problem. Although if you come collectively, say every member of the African Union endorses that, then it does carry some weight. Because then it also might have a multiply effect in seeing more declarations of that nature from other parts of the world, you see? And of course, when you're economically weak, then it's difficult to speak openly. If I were the leader of some economically dependent African country who's getting a lot of support for my agricultural sector from Israel, who's getting support for my intelligence sector and my military from Israel, would I really be speaking even the way I'm speaking right now? Of course, the answer is no. And that's a problem that many of these countries face. Many are economically dependent on Israel, and Israel has done a very good diplomatic effort in vigorous campaign to normalize relations with many African countries and offer, you know, economic packages. So that has compromised their ability to speak objectively and neutrally, and that is also part of the problem. They're in a very weak position, so they can't say much. You remember after, I think it was in 1973, when most African countries broke off diplomatic relations with Israel. So they were on the same page at that time. They spoke collectively, so it had much more impact. But now that Israel has successfully made a lot of inroads in normalizing relations, they are sort of compromised and cannot speak with a loud voice. You're almost pushing me to talk more about the weakness of these countries, because I'm very unforgiving to these leaders for putting us in such a compromised situation on many things, even food alone. Why should Africa be running to Ukraine and to Russia begging for food? But this is what Nkrumah warned in neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism. Page 29, he writes about it. He says, if we don't establish food independence and the trend in which we're importing food continues, independence is going to be meaningless. And he wrote this in 1965, and his words have now been borne out. We import $35 billion worth of food every year. Can you imagine what that amount of money could do to our domestic agriculture, to infrastructure, to healthcare systems, you know? So the weakness is tied to so many other things that African nations cannot do effectively. And one of them is speaking out effectively on this conflict. Although I must say, to their credit, most of them actually voted for the humanitarian ceasefire at the United Nations General Assembly. Many, I think, also abstained, but I think the majority voted for the ceasefire.
How do you think the future of the Palestinians look like?
Okay, that if you had asked me before this conflict erupted, I would have said very dire, very doomed. I think this ongoing conflict has put it back on the front pages. I think what must not be allowed to happen is that once the guns go silent, that people go back to sleep again. That should not be allowed to happen. The people that are coming out and protesting on the streets, the word ceasefire should be on their lips, but at the same time, two-state solution should also be on their lips. If you're coming out for the ceasefire, that is part of the conversation. You must come out for both ceasefire and a two-state solution, because you don't want a temporary solution. You want a permanent solution.
That is true.
And I want to say one other thing, though, and then I'll come to your question. This silencing of people is not good. Intimidating people into not talking openly will not take us anywhere and will not bring us closer to resolving this conflict. So let me give you one quick example, then I come to your question. In my class at John Jay College, I have 3 classes this semester of 25 students in each class, around that now. So in one of my classes, I say, well, this conflict is raging, it's all over the news. I know you young people want to speak on it. So I will allow 10 minutes just for any student to talk on this issue before we start today's lecture. 2 students spoke, most about the uneven coverage and the need really to have an ultimate peace solution. I said, only 2 students want to speak? I said, how many of you want to say something, but you're afraid that your words could get out of this classroom and could be misconstrued? 15 students put their hand up. Can you believe it? In a university, if students are afraid to comment on this issue, that is not a good sign. So I wanted to also say that before going to your question.
That is scary.
It is very scary when students are self-censoring and admitting that they are indeed self-censoring, which is actually kind of brave, you know,
wow,
to admit that they're self-censoring. Because I suspected that more than 2 students must be interested in speaking on this issue. And that's why I posed the question, you know.
Well, I mean, yeah, it's tough. I mean, I think it takes courage for you to be able to speak about such stuff, because everyone is afraid. I mean, it's speaking the truth, really, because now everyone is just, you know, pushing their own agenda. And so, you know, having individuals who really look at the reality for what it is and speak it out the way it is, it's kind of a challenge right now.
And I'm afraid for consequences too. So for example, if I worked at a corporate publication like the Daily News or the New York Times, would I be able to have an open conversation with you like this without worrying, oh, what might the publishers and the editors at the New York Times or the Daily News think about this? And what might happen to my paycheck? And then if I don't have a paycheck, who's going to pay my rent? Who's going to pay my bills? And that goes back to the same example I gave you earlier of the politicians afraid to say the right thing because they're saying, oh, how much campaign, donation, contribution am I going to lose? It's a terrible, terrible world we live in.
But I mean, thank you for, you know, shedding light on what's going on without taking any sides and really just analyzing the situation for what it is. I hope people will have an understanding of what's going on, because right now everyone is just like, hey, you know, Hamas is a terrorist organization and, you know, this is going on and, you know, the Palestinians are killing the Jews, and without really understanding what's going on the ground and maybe understanding the reality for what it is. Because as how you said, you know, legacy media, they usually just, you know, present it in a way that fits their own agenda. And hey, I mean, at least something to cheer us up. South Africa has won the Rugby World Cup.
Viva. Viva, viva, viva.
It's really good to see that.
Yes. And no, but I'm glad you mentioned South Africa, because now you let me think of one thing. The narrative in South Africa used to be, if Africans came to power, they would annihilate and exterminate Europeans because of the historical oppression, exploitation, the massacres, the deprivation, economic deprivation, political deprivation, that had been committed against them, right? That was this fear-mongering that was sold by supporters of the apartheid state. Did that happen? Of course not. In fact, some people are critical that the apartheid has not in fact changed in substance, only in symbolism. So I just bring that example to say that the world must reject fear-mongers, the people who say the Palestinians, if they have a state, would represent an existential threat to Israel. How would they, when you have a nuclear state fully supported by the United States, whose guaranteed security ensured by the United States? So let's not let fear-mongering divert our attention from having a solution which requires the state of Israel, but also a Palestinian state.
I mean, I think it sounds funny, right? Because you're on your homeland and 75% of your land has been taken, and apparently you are the one who poses a threat.
Yes. Well, but you know, the powerful corporate media have historically been able to set the narrative and distort the narrative. You know, thankfully we have the opportunity presented like by social media now to have conversations like this, and hope that more and more people are able to listen to these types of conversations and not allow the legacy media, as you call them, to dictate the narrative and the conversation.
Absolutely. I mean, I thank you so much for taking your time and being brave enough to talk about this, because yeah, it's sort of a challenge having people can tell you the truth as how it is. Because as I said again earlier, you know, in war, usually the first casualty is the truth. So
absolutely,
we have to keep speaking the truth and say things for what they are, really.
Absolutely. And I thank you for the opportunity always to come in conversation with you. And feel free to invite me anytime. And if I'm available, I'm happy to be on your show on any one of these topics.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Asante sana. Continue the good work.